We think that's something the NHL would want to be in, and we know that for us to maximize our potential, we would love to have the NHL in it.
A few months later, the city landed the Thrashers, Atlanta's first hockey team since the Flames.
I'd also like to thank all the fans back in Atlanta. All of us share in the excitement of our inaugural 1999-2000 season.
Phillips Arena, the home of the Thrashers.
First ever, first overall pick, Patrick Stefan.
Heatley got it back to Watkins. He scores. Power truck. Positive
Not lay blame on Danny Heatley for the accident that took our son from us.
But it's sad at the same time because I've been Thrasher for 8 years and I appreciate it for everything.
I'm excited beyond words to announce our purchase of the Atlanta Thrashers.
(1997). Bill Clinton begins his second term as president. A provocative new animated series called South Park hits the airwaves, and the NHL's expansion blitz kicks into overdrive. That June, after adding 5 new teams over the previous 6 years, the NHL granted franchises to 4 more cities: Nashville, Columbus, St. Paul, and Atlanta. That's right, Atlanta. As in Georgia. As in the Deep South. Not exactly a hockey hotbed. As a matter of fact, the NHL had previously tried to set up shop in Atlanta, and it flopped. The Atlanta Flames, which were formed in 1972 mostly as a means to keep the upstart World Hockey Association from grabbing the market, lasted only 8 seasons before relocating to Calgary on account of financial difficulties. Seemingly, however, this time around, Atlanta's NHL franchise would be on much firmer financial ground. After all, the ownership group responsible for bringing NHL hockey back to Atlanta was Time Warner, the media conglomerate fronted by billionaire Ted Turner, who also happened to own Major League Baseball's Atlanta Braves and the NBA's Atlanta Hawks. For Turner, getting a new stadium built, which was a precondition for expansion, was no problem. And not 6 weeks after the NHL announced that it was returning to Atlanta, the city demolished the rusting Omni Coliseum, home of the Hawks and previously the Flames, and started building a new stadium in its place, the multi-purpose Phillips Arena. As construction got underway, the fledgling franchise, which was slated to begin play for the 1999-2000 season, sought out its nickname, its identity. And before long, Turner settled on one that he figured would strike a chord with the people of Atlanta. His new NHL team would be called the Thrashers, a nod to Georgia's state bird, the brown thrasher.
We want this to be a landmark for downtown. We want it to be a recognizable symbol, and we want it to be a place where people feel like they have ownership of it. We want Atlantans to feel like this is their building.
Then came the hard part, putting together a team that could actually be respectable. That responsibility fell on Don Waddell, who was named the Thrashers' first general manager after serving as assistant GM for the Stanley Cup-winning Detroit Red Wings in 97-98. At the time, however, assembling a competitive team through an expansion draft was virtually impossible. Case in point, the Nashville Predators, who started play 1 year before the Thrashers and won just 28 games in their inaugural season. Back then, the league's already established teams were allowed to protect even more players from the expansion draft than they are today, which is to say, there was little more than scraps available for the Thrashers. The biggest names Atlanta landed in the 1999 expansion draft? Mark Tenorti, who actually retired before playing a game for the Thrashers. A 33-year-old Kelly Buchberger? Johan Garpenlov? It was slim pickings. Hell, the Thrashers didn't even try to find a starting goalie through the draft, preferring instead to swing a trade with Ottawa for veteran Damian Rhodes. As underwhelming as their draft was, though, the nascent Thrashers did have one big reason for optimism. Following a dizzying series of 11th-hour trades, Atlanta held the #1 pick in the 1999 entry draft, which wasn't exactly the greatest draft class in history, but wasn't without its gems. Among the future stars taken in that year's draft, Henrik Zetterberg, Ryan Miller, Daniel and Henrik Sedin, who respectively went 2nd and 3rd overall to Vancouver after hinting that they'd stay in Sweden if they didn't end up on the same NHL team together. So which superstar did the Thrashers end up taking 1st overall? That would be Patrick Stefan, a Czech center who spent 7 underwhelming seasons in the NHL and is now considered one of the greatest draft busts ever.
It was my dream, go to #1, and I just cannot believe it right now. I was so nervous, but my dream comes true, and I think this team is a great future, and I want to be part of them,
At the time, though, the Thrashers and their fan base were elated. They had their franchise cornerstone, and the team had already sold more than 12,000 season tickets for its inaugural campaign. And while there were bound to be growing pains, the future was bright in Atlanta, or so it seemed. Amid all the excitement and novelty, the Thrashers' first season unfolded very much as expected on the ice. It was ugly. Atlanta won a league-worst 14 games in 1999-2000 and also finished dead last in the NHL in both goals for and goals against. Perhaps the most troubling part, though, was that Stefan looked decidedly unexceptional in his first taste of NHL action. In 72 games for the Thrashers, the 19-year-old mustered just 5 goals and 20 assists. He didn't even sniff a Calder Trophy vote. Ultimately, however, the Thrashers' rough first season notwithstanding, the fans showed out in droves. That year, Atlanta finished 11th in the league in attendance, an impressive and auspicious showing for a quote-unquote non-traditional hockey market. Meanwhile, the Thrashers' woeful first season positioned them to net their first true superstar. With the second overall pick in the 2000 entry draft, the Thrashers selected Danny Heatley, a standout winger at the University of Wisconsin. And it wasn't long before Atlanta added another foundational piece. After stumbling through a dispiriting 23-win sophomore season, the Thrashers ended up with the number 1 pick in the 2001 entry draft. And there was no question who they were taking. Ilya Kovalchuk, an offensive dynamo and the first Russian player ever to go first overall in the NHL draft. Suddenly, after 2 rough introductory seasons in which their best player was a soon-to-be retired Ray Ferraro, the Thrashers had an actual core of young talent, and a promising one at that. Stefan clearly wasn't working out, but in Heatley and Kovalchuk, the Thrashers had the makings of a dynamic offense, and as the 2001-2002 season loomed, the Thrashers looked ready to take the next step, not necessarily to contention, but at least to respectability. Except they weren't. Despite the outsized efforts of Heatley and Kovalchuk, who finished first and second respectively in Calder Trophy voting, the Thrashers actually took a step backwards in 2001-2002. With no goaltending, no defense, and no secondary scoring to speak of, Atlanta finished with the worst record in the NHL for the second time in 3 years. And the fans were getting impatient. That season, only 2 years removed from their inception, the Thrashers finished third last in the NHL in attendance, averaging less than 14,000 fans per game. Clearly, Waddell had to do more than simply banking on early first-round draft picks to hit. Not an easy task given his persistent payroll limitations. In fact, not once in the pre-salary cap era did the Thrashers' payroll equal even 2/3 of the league average. Still, he did what he could. That offseason, Waddell overhauled his roster, brokering trades for Slava Kozlov and Sean McEachern, among others, before fleecing the Calgary Flames for Mark Savard early into the 02-03 campaign. And those moves, along with a mid-season coaching change that saw one-time Stanley Cup winner Bob Hartley replace Kurt Fraser, led to tangible progress for the Thrashers. That season, the Thrashers easily set a new franchise record for wins and finished less than 10 points back of a playoff spot. Meanwhile, they also finished 10th in the NHL in goals, with Heatley and Kovalchuk notching 41 and 38 respectively. Heatley, by the way, ended up with 89 points, good for 9th in the NHL, and took home All-Star Game MVP honors with a historic 4-goal effort.
Tiger leaves it. Heatley in the middle for 4. Heatley a shot. He's got it! Heatley's the 5th ever to score 4 goals in an All-Star game.
Danny Heatley. How about that? The East has 4 goals to tie. He's got them all.
Finally, it seemed, the Thrashers were a team on the rise. Not only were their youngsters blossoming into stars, and not only was there considerable depth on their roster, but the Thrashers also had their ostensible goalie of the future in Kari Lehtinen, their second overall pick in 2002. It might have taken longer than they'd hoped, but there was genuine promise in Atlanta heading into the 03-04 campaign. And then disaster struck. On September 29, 2003, just over 2 weeks before the Thrashers' season opener, Heatley lost control of his Ferrari while driving around Atlanta with his friend and teammate Dan Snyder. According to police, Heatley was driving at approximately 130 kilometers per hour when he spun out of control and crashed into a brick and wrought iron fence. The collision split the car in half, and Snyder was thrown from the vehicle, resulting in a fractured skull. Snyder, who was 25 at the time, went into a coma from which he never woke up. Meanwhile, Heatley suffered a broken jaw, a concussion, and tore 3 ligaments in his right knee, among other injuries. Years later, Heatley pleaded guilty to second-degree vehicular homicide, a charge that could have led to jail time had Snyder's family not been so gracious. And on top of forever changing Heatley's life and the lives of Snyder's loved ones, that unthinkable tragedy also changed the trajectory of the Thrashers organization. Heatley's injuries kept him sidelined for much of the 03-04 season, a somber one that saw the Thrashers stagnate despite a hot start and a monster campaign from Kovalchuk, who finished in a 3-way tie for the league lead with 41 goals. Eventually, the sullen Heatley decided that he needed out of Atlanta. Over the course of the 04-05 lockout, during which Heatley played in both Switzerland and Russia, the 24-year-old sold his home in Atlanta and formally requested a trade. And in August of 05, with a new CBA ratified and a new NHL season around the corner, the Thrashers obliged him, trading Heatley to the Ottawa Senators in exchange for fellow All-Star winger Marian Hossa and veteran defenseman Greg DeVries. Just like that, the Thrashers' first superstar was gone. Although, to his credit, Hossa did a remarkable job replicating Heatley's all-star production in the years to come. For that reason, it's a stretch to say that the Heatley tragedy in and of itself doomed the Thrashers organization. Frankly, the Heatley tragedy obscured the goings-on behind the scenes that ultimately played a much larger role in the Thrashers' collapse. Before we go any further though, let's clarify something. By 2003, Time Warner, the Thrashers' original owners, had merged with AOL. In other words, by the early 2000s, it was AOL Time Warner that owned the Thrashers. And well, AOL Time Warner was having a real rough go of it in the early 2000s. In fact, in 2002, the company reported a net loss of almost $99 billion. In light of their financial troubles, AOL Time Warner started to liquidate. And in September of 2003, just days before the fateful Heatley crash, AOL Time Warner agreed to sell the Thrashers, the NBA's Hawks, and the rights to Phillips Arena to a consortium of 9 businessmen known as the Atlanta Spirit. And that, more than anything else, was the death knell for the Thrashers. See, the Spirit were never all that interested in hockey or the Thrashers, who, by their accounting, were losing tens of millions of dollars per year. In fact, as they later admitted in a lawsuit filing, the Spirit wanted to sell the Thrashers during the 04-05 lockout, practically 10 seconds after acquiring them. Before they could finalize a deal, however, a rift erupted within the ownership group, a years-long legal battle that began, believe it or not, over the Hawks' trade for Joe Johnson. As you can imagine, amid the infighting within an already disinterested ownership group, the Thrashers were little more than an afterthought. Ironically enough, however, it was during this period of distracted and apathetic ownership, and with their very future up in the air, that the Thrashers reached the pinnacle of their existence. Upon returning from the lockout, with Hossa replacing Heatley and several veteran additions like Peter Bondra and Bobby Holik filling out the roster, the Thrashers enjoyed their finest season yet. In 05-06, the Thrashers managed a winning record for the first time ever, finishing second in the Southeast Division and missing out on their first ever playoff berth by only 2 points. Meanwhile, Kovalchuk, Savard, and Hossa each recorded 92 or more points. Since the turn of the century, a trio of teammates each hitting 92 points has only happened 3 other times. Still, the best was yet to come. Despite losing Savard to free agency that summer, the Thrashers enjoyed their best ever season in 06-07. Propelled by an 100-point outburst from Hossa, a 42-goal effort from Kovalchuk, and a stellar year from Lettinen, the Thrashers went 43-28-11 that season, capturing their first and only Southeast Division title and their first and only playoff berth. It was momentous. It was cathartic. It was also extremely brief. In their first round matchup against the New York Rangers, the number 3 seeded Thrashers barely put up a fight. Atlanta lost games 1 and 2 at home, each by a margin of 1 goal, then got pummeled 7-0 in Game 3 at Madison Square Garden before getting swept out of the best of 7 with a 4-2 defeat in Game 4. From there, things unraveled quickly for the franchise. After getting off to an 0-6 start the following season, the Thrashers axed Heatley. Months later, with a second straight playoff appearance not in the cards and Hossa nearing free agency, Waddell traded the talented winger to Pittsburgh for a first-round pick and a package highlighted by grinder Colby Armstrong. Suddenly, Kovalchuk was the only star left in Atlanta's dressing room, and soon enough, he'd be gone too. After 2 more seasons of sub-500 finishes and paltry attendance numbers, and with little progress made in extension talks with Kovalchuk, the Thrashers traded away the only icon they ever had. In February of 2010, Atlanta traded Kovalchuk, their all-time leader in games played, goals, and assists, to New Jersey, a funereal move that hinted at the broader demise that was looming. Because shortly thereafter, the legal quagmire that had tied ownership's hands for years was resolved. In December 2010, the consortium's dissenting member, so to speak, was finally bought out, clearing the way for the now 7-man ownership group to do as they pleased. And with the Thrashers allegedly losing roughly $20 million per year, they were all very much in agreement over what they wanted to do. They wanted to sell. And despite their stated preference to keep the team in Atlanta, everybody knew what their top priorities were: getting the right price and getting a deal done quickly. And sure enough, after only a few months of searching, they found a buyer. And for the second time, NHL fans in Atlanta watched their team disappear. In May of 2011, the Spirit sold the Thrashers to True North Sports and Entertainment, a Winnipeg-based company that intended to bring NHL hockey back to Manitoba's capital.
On behalf of my family, our partner David Thompson, and our entire organization, I am excited beyond words to announce our purchase of the Atlanta Thrashers.
NHL, welcome home. Here in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Winnipeg had lost their beloved Jets when they relocated to Arizona and rebranded into the Coyotes in '96, but now, just like Atlanta, Winnipeg was getting a second shot. Except they were sticking with their original nickname. Less than a month after the sale was finalized, True North announced that the former Thrashers franchise would henceforth be known as the Jets. The Winnipeg Jets, who would begin play in 2011-2012 and would make their home at the then-named MTS Center, which had housed Manitoba's AHL team since 2004. And just like that, the Atlanta Thrashers were no more. History. Inglorious history at that. One playoff berth in 11 seasons, consistently poor attendance, dysfunctional ownership. Their existence, simply put, was forgettable. But maybe, just maybe, the story of the Atlanta Thrashers isn't over yet. Maybe there's another chapter still to be penned. Maybe, for hockey fans in Atlanta, the third time's the charm.